to the finals of WR-NUS Pre-UADC Debating Championships. My name is Amira. I'll be the chair judge for this finals panel. Judging with me is Viha, Enting, Amirul, Hannah, Daryl, and Silla. In government, we have Team Personality Club. And in opposition, we have Apa Lagi Cina Mau. And Kara will be timing today's debate. So without further ado, on the motion, this House believes that feminists should regret the narrative that motherhood is an intrinsically fulfilling experience. I now invite the Prime Minister.
My mother is a feminist, but when I told her that I didn't want to have children, she told me it's ridiculous because it's supposed to be meaningful and I have to go through it regardless. Now, the reason for that is this. It is the idea that motherhood by itself should intrinsically be meaningful, meaning that it should be its own reward to begin with. But what this translates into society is that oftentimes we are told that this is something that is expected of us. If not, it is a marker of success of how we are as human beings or how we are as adults to begin with. And I think the first thing here then we should understand this read is this, right? That it's about feminists and whether or not they should reject this notion. And I think principally it's quite clear why this should be the case. I think that at the point where they don't reject these narratives, that this narrative allows itself to proliferate, it allows itself to impose a choice on how women lead their own lives to begin with. And insofar as feminism is about maximizing choices of women without their having to suffer penalties for these very choices that they make, we think it is problematic at the point where the feminist movement fails to do anything about this to begin with. When society tells you that it is your duty, therefore, to be a mother, that we think feminists should need to challenge this, because this should not be something that is expected of them, even though it's something that can make people happy. So let's get this clear, that the ideal world is obviously one in which you don't have a dominant narrative, that people can do things that can make them happy to begin with. But if we have to defend something, then we're willing to say that we want to educate women on the kinds of choices they can make and how it's going to affect their lives as a whole, so that at least they can make choices that can make them happier otherwise. But let's then understand how the societal pressure looks like and why I said this is problematic. I think the main thing here that I've already talked about here is this, right? That it becomes a marker of success as an adult, and it becomes what socially expected of you. But the problem here then is this, that at the point where everyone seems to think that way, it's very difficult for individuals to question what they want in life to begin with because of the societal pressure, because everyone tells you that it is important. This means then that, in fact, they don't often actively question, but sometimes they don't even know what's wrong at the point where they are unhappy with a child. And this by itself essentially means that consciously and subconsciously, your choices are restricted because you have been guided and told that you have to be a mother regardless. Now, that by itself is already problematic. But more importantly, the second thing here is also this, right? If your expectation of having a child is often tied to expectation of getting married to begin with, and at the point where individuals, no, hold on a moment, try to opt out of that, there's no ability for them to do so. Sure.
Do you agree that motherhood is a thankless task?
So yes, I agree, and I'm going to move on to that right now, right? I think the second thing here is also this, that at the point where you say that something is intrinsic and something is intrinsically meaningful, and you tell people that serves as its own reward, they ignore the kinds of things that mothers give up, because they assume that the kinds of things that they are giving up is supposed to lead somewhere to begin with, meaning to say that the kinds of challenges that people face are often things that people say will lead to a fruitful outcome, or it's things that they should have to go through regardless. And I think this by itself is problematic because oftentimes these kinds of expectations tell you to give up a lot of things to begin with. For instance, your career aspirations, for instance, giving up time with your social circle because you just cannot afford time when your toddler is at home where they need someone to take care of you. But more importantly, understand that this kind of narrative often interacts with society in ways that are bad for these women as a whole. Because at the point where society often tells women that it is their duty to procreate, and you tell women that it should be something that is intrinsically meaningful to them, it's very difficult for them to opt out of this to begin with, right? Because they believe that this is something that is supposed to make them happy. No, thank you. But more importantly, at the point where you say that something is intrinsic and serves as its own reward, it also means that you're less likely to provide things like compensations for raising a child to begin with. What do I mean? I mean that at the point where a mother has trials and tribulations that she needs to overcome, a lot of her choices are not only restricted, but people fail to try to make it so that it's easier for her to lead her life. Like, for instance, when you're employed, that it's far less likely that employers are going to give you any form of support or accommodation when you're pregnant, right? Because they're just going to assume that you're going to have a full-time job out of taking care of your child, and given that it's something meaningful to you, that you're probably going to be the selfish person and do that to begin with. But this also means that it ignores the kinds of opportunities, it removes opportunities that people can give to these women to begin with. But otherwise, it also means that at the point where you romanticize these trials and tribulations, that you also restrict choices in other ways. For instance, when you no longer have provisions for things like birth control, or when you have things like abortions at the point where society thinks that this is important. But the last thing here is also this, that you never care about women at the point where they have other effects to begin with, like postpartum depression, or when you have things like essentially, the point here is this, right? That people just lack a lot of empathy for mothers. And I think this by itself is problematic at the point where you deprive individuals of the kind of societal support and network that is often necessary for them to lead lives, especially when they're going through something that is difficult. But the last thing here is also this. How this translates, nothing in real life, is that oftentimes this narrative exists across every single person to begin with. So not only do people treat you differently, but the last point here is this, that feminists often end up failing to support other women to begin with. Because when you fail to question these kinds of narratives, and when you fail to question whether or not they actually have a place as something that is intrinsically meaningful in your life, what this means then is that some feminists end up buying into these things anyway, that they lose the power to support other women through their choices at the point where it's not something that makes sense to them. And this is often because that they don't actively question these kinds of things to begin with. The world that we want to support is a world where feminists actively question and sometimes reject these kinds of narratives, because we think that feminism should ultimately be one where people can lead their own lives and can lead their own and can live by their own choices to begin with. To the extent that motherhood is often something they have to sink a lot of your resources into, not only do people tell you that it is one of the only choices you have, but oftentimes you end up not being able to make up for the lost time that you have with other things. Because for instance, your social networks just don't exist anymore. For instance, even though you have career aspirations, and these are not things they can reach out to anymore because people just don't put value in you to begin with. I think the world that is ideal is a world in which feminists actively question these kinds of things, where they carve out a space that is acceptable to live, where it is acceptable to live their own lives, first with other women, then with society at large. For instance, with your families, friends, and allies. We propose.
I thank the Prime Minister, and I invite Leader of Opposition.
When the Sandy Hook massacre happened in the United States, Barack Obama described children as effectively having your heart outside of the body, walking around, and that day so many of them were suddenly gone. This is such a universal and visceral experience that almost everyone almost intuitively understood. That for feminists to opt out of trying to shape and valorize the experience is for feminists to abdicate their duty to look after one half of humanity and to cater to the lived experiences of the vast majority of women in the societies. I'm going to talk about two things. Firstly, why it's critical that feminists stick to this narrative to be able to shape a feminist narrative of what motherhood should be for children and for themselves. And secondly, I'm going to talk about the predominant issue of choice, about how this narrative serves to facilitate and validate choice, contrary to what they say. But 2 points of contention first. First, this overriding idea by the side that this narrative forces mothers to have children and to see themselves as less just because they don't have kids. Now, let's be clear here. By supporting this narrative, we are not saying that feminist discourse shouldn't tell women that they can be everything they want to be, that they are not any less just because they choose not to be mothers. But at the same time, we can also tell women that if you make a choice to become a mother, it will be an invaluable experience. It will be one hell of a ride, it will be an adventure, but at the end of the day, the love that you're able to give another person is invaluable and rewarding in its own right. Those two choices can exist at the same time because we posit that women can hold two thoughts in their heads at the same time. So with that out of the way, the next argument here is the idea of social policy, how this actually causes governments to be less, to treat mothers worse. That's just not true, right? It's equally possible that precisely because motherhood is valorized, that states are more predisposed to do things like helping single mothers or providing mothers with childcare support, for instance. Like both are equally possible. In fact, we think our scenario is even more possible. So this point, not really relevant. First argument, the idea of a feminist narrative of motherhood. Let's put it this way, right? Regardless of what you think feminists should do, the vast majority of women in the world are mothers and situate their identities around being mothers for a variety of reasons that you may or may not agree with. If a feminist would come out and say motherhood is not intrinsically rewarding, their message will no longer receive as much of an audience amongst women all over the world who may not have read the vagina monologues or be well versed in your social justice discourse in universities. The fact of the matter is that feminists have a lot to say about motherhood, and we cannot leave the narrative of what motherhood should be to non-feminists. That is precisely where your stereotype of a barefoot mother with a baby making machine in the kitchen comes about. It is feminists who can come in to say that you can be a mother who can bring up girls, who can be kick-ass women, who can challenge the patriarchy and be whoever they want. It is feminists who say that you can raise boys who are respectful of women and treat women as human beings. Those are invaluable strands of discourse that we need women to be receptive to, and the only way to do that is if feminists do not opt out of this discussion of how to make motherhood more valuable, how to make motherhood more valorized. Feminism must be relevant to the lived experiences of the people they seek to help. Their policy will cause feminists to abdicate their duty to do this. We oppose that. Second, and this rebuts the vast majority of that case, the idea of choice. We agree that the premise of feminism is that you should be able to facilitate the choice of women everywhere. The problem here is that the predominant current second wave feminist discourse has rightly focused on workplace rights, on equal pay for equal work, and things like that. And that's fair. We think in the earlier 1900s, it's actually a consequence of white feminism, where the main focus of middle class women and white women is the workplace. And we don't see any problem with that. And therefore, narratives have been developed. Like you should not give up your career to be a mother too early. In fact, just this morning I read a newspaper about the royal wedding, which we are very excited about. Right? People are saying Meghan Markle has given up her career to marry a prince. Is that really right? Our answer to that is, if it makes her happy, of course it's right. And that's precisely the point. We think women who make a choice to do things like give up supposed more feminist goals, like giving up their careers, giving up a high-powered career to stay at home, to be with their kids, should also be valorized for that choice, because it is still a choice that is valuable, it is still a choice that we should celebrate as well. You should not be seen as a bad feminist just because you choose to stay at home. And within the realm of the kind of feminist discourse that they want to propagate, that is precisely what they're advocating. Go.
So at the point where you have multiple choices that an individual can take, when you say that something is intrinsically meaningful, it essentially invalidates all other choices that a woman can make to begin with.
No, I can say having a career is meaningful, I can say being a mother is meaningful as well. Those two things can exist at the same time. One doesn't invalidate the other. Next, this argument of how we need this narrative as a corrective to the rigors of motherhood and to validate the choice of the vast majority of women who choose to be mothers. Now let's understand this. Women choose to be mothers regardless of what the patriarchy of feminists actually say. Like in countries like Norway, the most gender-equitable countries in the world, there actually was an increase in birth rates precisely because free of pressures of the patriarchy, many women will still choose to be mothers because there's a biological imperative of whatever reason you may think of. The truth here is, women, once they choose to be mothers, have to work labor over for 20 to 30 years to bring a child up. Usually it is them and the father alone with a child. It is difficult. But after 20-30 years, you don't have any tangible, actual reward for your labor. The child walks out of the door, and sometimes, even though they may still come back, they are no longer yours. The fact of the matter is that the reward must come from the social recognition that this narrative can provide to mothers as well. To say that the choice you made over the last 30 years was an incredibly valuable choice. You did something bigger than yourself, and that should be celebrated. We don't think feminists should opt out of this particular discourse, this narrative, is a profoundly valuable discourse. Because we must acknowledge that motherhood is hard, that kids can be assholes sometimes, that sometimes love is not enough and you need to persevere. Just like being a fireman can sometimes be incredibly difficult. Being a soldier can sometimes be incredibly difficult, and sometimes you are doing things that you rather not do. But the knowledge that you're doing something that is bigger than yourself to serve a purpose that is more noble than your individualistic wants and desires is precious and should be preserved. But more than that, we think when we drill down to particularities, feminism must be the value to the lived experiences of people. And we think it's often in minority communities that the role of the mother is especially prominent. For instance, in African American communities, because of the rigors of the drug wars, many fathers were sent to prison in places like inner cities in the United States. Therefore, the black matriarch has become an especially prominent figure in the African American narrative. Go and read African American literature. That figure is predominant as well. We celebrate a narrative that says that the choices that these figures, that these individuals make are valuable, are fulfilling, and are valuable in and of themselves, not because of anything else. We think that needs to happen in order to validate and shape the discourse of what motherhood should be and how motherhood should be celebrated. For all these reasons, we are immensely proud to oppose.
I thank Leader of Opposition and now invite Deputy Prime Minister.
SMU! SMU! SMU!
Very fast stuff. Thank you very much. For every mother who finds motherhood an intrinsically fulfilling and rewarding experience, there are mothers who thoroughly regret having children but who cannot speak up because of the societal stigma surrounding the decisions they made when they were barely 18, 21, or whatnot. For every mother who finds that motherhood is an intrinsically fulfilling experience, there are many who feel pressured into being mothers, pressured into being married in the first place. Women who would never otherwise have been able to realize either their career aspirations or the other things, the other myriad number of things that make their life meaningful and purposeful. And that is the problem with narratives. Because while motherhood can be a subjectively fulfilling thing for you as an individual based on your own personal priorities, there is a unique, pernicious harm when you create a narrative and propagate it throughout the rest of society and expect other people to be able to hold up that narrative and force other people to conform to such a narrative. That's what it means to regret a narrative, not merely to regret subjective preferences, and that is the clash that side opposition has yet to deal with in today's debate. The first thing I want to talk about is about what exactly it means to be intrinsic, right? Because for something to be intrinsic, to have some intrinsic value, it means there must be some sort of objective value that applies regardless of the circumstances of a human being's existence. It means that it cannot merely be subjective, and it cannot merely adopt the best case scenario that is good for individual women, but they have to defend the narrative that it is useful or that it is fulfilling to women as a whole in society. And I think we shouldn't broadly characterize women as all wanting to be mothers. Women are just varied as human beings, men are varied as human beings, we're all varied as human beings, and I think it is foolish for us to have to expect that women have to conform to societal notions of what it means to lead a meaningful life. But I think the bigger point I want to make here is that the history of narratives that motherhood is a fulfilling experience intrinsically has never been a neutral one. Because they've often been used by men in positions of power in decades past and in centuries past to justify them working at home, being homemakers, precisely because they had a vested incentive in ensuring that women never became doctors, that they never went to medical school, that they never became business people or sat on the boards of large MNCs. That is a sort of pernicious narrative that you can deal with. So in theory, it might be a useful narrative, it might be correct, but in practice, it carries with it emotional and historical baggage that means that we cannot interpret it in a way that side opposition wants us to interpret it. The second thing I want to talk about is on the impacts of such a narrative on women. We talked to you in our first speaker about how consciously and subconsciously there is pressure, right? Pressure exerted upon you by your family members, by your friends, by the rest of society, by governments, when you talk about what are the accepted markers of being a successful adult in our society: graduating, getting a job, getting married, having children. These are the rites of passage that women are expected to fulfill, and either subconsciously, they come to internalize these things even though there is some sort of indescribable unhappiness in the back of their heads with regard to why am I actually doing this? Or sometimes they are conscious of it, but they can't speak out because every time they speak out, they're going to be shamed by their family for not showing love to their kids or not showing 100% commitment to the job of raising kids, or being shamed by the rest of society for not fulfilling your societal duty, your female version of national service, as it were. That is pernicious, and we will never stand for that. The second thing I want to talk about is about the intrinsic rewards, right? No, thank you. I think they fail to understand that in theory, governments and companies will valorize mothers for embarking on a sacrifice, raising the next generation of individuals. But most companies are self-serving. Most companies have vested incentives in saying, since you guys already feel like you're intrinsically rewarded for being a mother, why do I need to give you additional accommodations like maternity leave, more flexible childcare and working arrangements? Why do governments need to provide baby bonuses? Because Singapore is an exception in that regard. In reality, while in theory we may valorize mothers, in practice we often fail to put our money where our mouth is, precisely because it is about the people's reactions to the narrative that motherhood is an intrinsically fulfilling experience that matters, not merely the theory of what makes motherhood intrinsically fulfilling. The end result of everything that I talked about is that women as a whole will never be able to achieve their aspirations under a narrative like this, or even if they do, they have to struggle twice as hard as men do in order to be able to achieve these things. They might have glass ceilings that they have to endure as a result of the narrative and the glass ceiling that they have to live under in society. That they are never able to explore all the other things that make for a fulfilling life, and that they're never supported in their journey of being a mother if they choose to become a mother in the first place. It means that people like us are raised without adequate support, from the rest of society and from our societal institutions. But before I move on, go.
You cannot say that feminism must cater to all womanhood and ignore the effect of this narrative may have to validate and help mothers who actually choose to be mothers, and help themselves to validate and valorize their choice.
Right, so in best case scenario of your side, we are perfectly happy to defend, feminists talking to mothers and telling them that motherhood is an entirely legitimate choice. Because remember, the end goal of feminism is to maximize the choices of women and ensure that women are not penalized for their choices any more than men are. In other words, subjectively, it is an entirely legitimate choice. We should not penalize you for it. That is the best case scenario we're prepared to defend. In the worst case scenario, however, there are a good proportion of mothers who regret having children because they were pressurized by society, by their husbands, into having children. What happens to these mothers who cannot speak up? They suffer a significant amount of psychological stress, of depression, and an entire lost life worth of living, precisely because they couldn't have challenged that particular conception of what it means to lead a meaningful life. Under our side, it is a lot easier for women to speak out without being socially stigmatized. It is a lot easier for them to find support groups where they can share their experiences, where they can admit, I still love my kids, but if I could go back to 20 years before, I won't have them. And that is a perfectly legitimate choice and a perfectly legitimate expression of your life choices to make. I think it's important that women are allowed to express their regret at having children in order to ensure that they can educate the next generation of females to think twice about what is it that they want in life. It's okay if you want to have children, but you better make sure that that's what you want. The last thing I want to talk about is about the worst case scenario, in which everything they say is correct. Even if it is true that a majority of women in developed societies have aspirations to be mothers and that they will benefit from such a narrative, we need to talk about the many women in developing societies, or even women in societies like ours, right? For whom motherhood and career aspirations can't happen at the same time, either due to discrimination because you're pregnant or because you're a woman, or for many different reasons, which means you have to make the ultimate choice. And at a point in time in which women's participation in the workforce is still not optimal, that we don't see them in the tech spheres, we don't see them in boardrooms, we don't see them as often in the highest echelons of government and business. At that point in time, we will buy the trade-off. If it means having fewer mothers, and in order to ensure that we encourage more women to pursue their career aspirations and truly fight for their place in the workplace, we're perfectly happy to defend that. Vote Gov.
I thank Deputy Prime Minister, and I invite Deputy Leader of Opposition.
the absence of a narrative that says that motherhood is an intrinsically fulfilling experience, the outcome is not one in which women are told not to be mothers. Other pressures continue to apply that says that you have to still be a mother and you still have to give birth to a baby. Like, for example, the pressures of the fact that you have to carry on a family legacy, and due to a biological imperative, women are the only people who are able to do that. After that, women are still forced to stay at home to take care of their children more often than not, because the 9 months they took off as a result of their maternity, for instance, sets them back on the career ladder, and they're already earning less than the men. What this ultimately means is that in the absence of the narrative that their side wants to regret, what we have instead is a narrative in which women are still coerced into the exact same choices that they wanted to regret, but at the same time can find no actual meaning from that particular experience and no support from the rest of society. Before we move on any further, I first want to characterize what exactly this narrative looks like, because I think that on their side, they seem to be very shoddy understanding of how narratives are propagated, choosing instead to be very convenient in saying that we're just saying that motherhood is an intrinsically fulfilling experience because it is magically an intrinsically fulfilling experience. But rather, we think the way that the narrative works in current status quo is the reason why people think and are able to believe that motherhood is a fulfilling experience is because we characterize the way that mothers interact with their children as being something that is full of love, as being a very altruistic experience. Because the truth of the matter is that when you have a child, you can't guarantee that the child is great. You're going to have to become pregnant, you're going to have to deal with mood swings, you're going to have to deal with hormones, you're going to have to deal with gaining weight, you're going to have to deal with a baby taking time off of work, your body never being the same again, potentially your child becoming a disappointment with a GPA of 2.0, going to KL every weekend, not caring about you, sometimes even forgetting your birthday. It's a pretty crap and thankless experience at the end of the day. And the reason why mothers are seen to still have a fulfilling experience despite the overwhelming objective reality that is a terrible thing for women to have to go through is because of the narrative that says that it is an experience that is full of love, that the woman who is doing something for the good of the future of humanity and for another individual. In that circumstance, we think that this is one of the only things that currently firstly gives women that solace and comfort at a point at which motherhood seems like a very difficult experience, but secondly also is one of the last things that is propping up a society that does not care about the choices that women want to make, and is the only thing that's elevating the status of women as a mother above that of not above that of everything else, but above that of what they were before. Firstly, Adil says, no, this is an overwhelming and dominant narrative, but it never explained to us even once why is it that individuals cannot opt out of intrinsically fulfilling experiences for other kinds of intrinsically fulfilling experiences. I don't think it's a difficult rhetoric or narrative to believe that working and trying to get further ahead in your career is something that women may choose to prioritize as well, but the choice to become a mother is also something that they ought to prioritize, especially recognizing this happens within the feminist discourse, which means that women who are oftentimes most affected by this specific narrative that's propagated by feminists are women who choose to identify themselves as feminists as well, which means that in a world in which the dominant narrative is that you ought to be more successful, that you ought to be as good as men in the workplace, the choice that a lot of these women make to become mothers and make certain sacrifices in their career or other parts of their life is often one that is seen to be their own fault because they recognize the sacrifices that being a mother was supposed to be, and therefore they are responsible for the lack of career progression that they have. We need to give these women something else to cling on to as well. But the second thing that they completely ignored from Robin's speech was the idea of what feminists can do with this specific narrative. So note that in the absence of this particular narrative, we think what's more likely to happen is that other non-feminists are able to dominate that specific narrative and say things like, for example, look, I am your father, I am the one who's making the money in this family, I am the one who is the most responsible for you being the success that you are today. The role of the mother is then relegated to the idea of a baby-making machine because it's the only use that that particular woman has ever had in that society. The veneration of motherhood is specifically important in terms of being able to give a value back to a woman, no thank you, who is now who is performing a function for society that is largely unseen and behind closed doors and is only most felt by the individual that is most proximate to her child. The next argument that we want to talk about is how then does this actually translate to policy changes in society? Because on the other side of the house, in 1 second, Adil, they argue that this justifies sacrifices that women have to make because they are getting a reward in the form of the intrinsically fulfilling experience. Before I move on to explain why it's not the case, go ahead.
So let's assume that you indeed provide comfort to millions of mothers by propagating this narrative. What is therefore your long-term strategy for societal change?
the policy that we just told you, which is that we would like allow you to make both choices. If you want to become a mother, that's fine. If you want to be, successful in like your career later on, that's also fine. And that is probably something that we should work towards dismantling, like other like structures that prevent women from being able to progress in those places. But specifically in the interaction, like now we're talking about policy, right? Specifically in the interaction between motherhood and being at work, the reason why the veneration of motherhood is important when it comes to the like the way that we give support for mothers is because it is only when we say that being a mother is an intrinsically fulfilling experience that we recognize the value that oftentimes being a mother has to these children, to the woman herself, which means that in those circumstances, it is far more likely that we will try to make things as easy as possible for that woman to be able to spend time with the child that she presumably cares about. In the absence of this, we think that what actually happens is that women who, for example, have children are often asked questions like, why don't you just put your child in childcare? Why don't you just leave your child with your grandparents instead? Why do you have to spend so much time with your child? And any time taken off of work in order to try and create that relationship with that specific child and to be able to enjoy perhaps that experience of motherhood becomes one that is denigrated as being you making those choices at the expense of your own career. We think that the policy that says that motherhood is an intrinsically fulfilling experience recognizes that mothers have a special place in society and ought to be given allowances and policy help, especially at the point at which families are able to control that specific narrative and explain that women should be able to both be mothers as well as be empowered in the workplace as well. We think on our side, we therefore actually allow for more political capital for individuals to look at the position of mothers and say, yes, these people do deserve things like longer maternity leave, even if it doesn't have an economic outcome or output to our company, but there is an economic output and an economic benefit to the rest of society when women do these things. Or it also says that women perhaps should not have their pay cut as a result of taking time off of work, and they ought not be forced into putting their children in things like childcare services and the like. At the end of the day, if we recognize that motherhood is a thankless task, we firstly need to have an outlet of solace for women who are still going to be forced into these positions, but also we need to recognize that mothers do have an important place to play in society.
I thank Deputy Leader of Opposition. I now invite Government Whip.
Can you hear me? I think it's disingenuous for side opposition to masquerade as a side protecting women. If you look at the choices of words in their previous two speakers, I think if you remove all the euphemisms that they use and you just look at the core of their case, it's extremely fatalistic. The premise of their case is that we live in a patriarchal society, therefore we should not do anything and provide solace towards women. I'm going to question two things in this debate. I'm going to question whether they actually get their solace and what the feminist movement should strive for. I think firstly, the feminist movement is one that should not play into current societal notions. I think the feminist movement ought to be more aspirational, right? Like the core premise of why the movement even started was to go against the grain and to challenge patriarchal notions. This is antithetical to the very principle on which we accord women's rights or why we fight for certain things. I think that recognizing that the large bulk of their case was something that's extremely defeatist, I think that this means that it's not in the best interest of women. I think the question of this debate, therefore, is that which sides annex more societal change. At the point in which they play into current patriarchal narratives, this necessarily means that they entrench the notion that it's a mother's duty, that it's a woman's duty to take care of the family, it's a woman's duty to make sacrifices for their family. I think that this debate has only been revolving around two things, narratives and choices, and I'll explain to you why we take this debate conclusively on both grounds. I think that this debate has to be retrospective. I think that this debate has to be about what the narrative has done to people on the ground and how people outside of the feminist movement has interpreted this narrative. I don't think this should be what we hope the narrative should be or how we can alter this narrative so that it helps women. I think that the pernicious thing about narratives is that they don't exist just within the sphere of feminism or just within people who have the best interests of women at heart. I think that the pernicious thing about narratives is that they exist in the minds of your employees. They exist in the minds of your closest family members and the people that you call like your friends. I think this necessarily means that there's an inability for individuals who are not women to empathize with your plight at the point in which they expect it to be an intrinsic intrinsically fulfilling experience. I think this debate therefore has to factor in people who exist outside the feminist sphere who cannot commensurate or empathize with the plight of mothers. No thanks. So let's talk about narratives. Because Germany seems to assume that there can be different kinds of narratives that individuals can opt into, and you can opt in and out of narratives. I don't think that's the case. I think that narratives construct how your society is like and what they value within your society. At the point in which it's absurd for me to claim that I don't want to go to university and start working, I think there is a disproportionate amount of societal pressure that these narratives cause. And this necessarily means that there's a limited bandwidth within your society. So any of the argumentation saying that you can have multiple bandwidths, saying that motherhood can sometimes be a subjectively fulfilling experience, simply does not exist, right? At the point in which it's the dominant narrative that clouds out other forms of interpretation of what motherhood is, this necessarily means that mothers cannot have other conceptions of what motherhood is like to them. And this goes against the principles of what feminism ought to be, right? Because feminism ought to be about letting women make their own choices. When you when you tell women what these choices are and what are the a priori best choices, this is antithetical to what the feminist movement ought to stand for. Therefore, narratives are pernicious because extremely dominant individuals cannot opt out of it. I think that these narratives, has to be juxtaposed to other narratives within our society. Because at the point in which you say motherhood is an intrinsically fulfilling experience, this means that your other choices are immediately seen as selfish. At the point in which you have the ability to be a mother but you choose to be a career woman, this is where other individuals within your society that are not feminists will necessarily call you selfish. This is because, right, intrinsically is something that is devoid of situational context. At the point in which you say something is intrinsic, this means that all other situational factors are disregarded. This means that if you are poor, if you are a single mother, all these factors are disregarded in the face of the fact that you are a mother and you should be happy. This means that your aspirations as an individual are automatically seen as less important, right? The rhetoric that the rest of society uses, that this is important, right? The rest of society is that you should have chosen to be a mother because you have been received more fulfillment as a mother, right? It's absurd for you not to want to be a mother at the point in which it's supposed to be something that is intrinsically fulfilling. It's supposed to be something above everything else. There is no narrative right now in status quo that says having a career is something that is intrinsically fulfilling. I think the converse is true, right? It's more true, right? That having a career is often things that people do out of necessity, not because they get enjoyment out of it. Recognizing this is the fact, I think that this means that there's a disproportionate asymmetry in terms of how people view this narrative. And this means that individuals are not able to make an informed choice. And I'll explain to you the impact of this argument a bit more later. But I think this means that when an individual or woman wants to weigh in the decision-making calculus of a woman who wants to weigh between choosing a career and choosing to be a mother, this means that the choices are often disproportionately weighed in favor of being a mother, given that they feel that they can get some form of transcendent happiness from being a mother because of the word intrinsically, right? Or because of the way that this narrative is being purported. This is what coercion looks like. I think that, no thanks. So let's talk about more practical harms of this narrative. I think that given that mothers feel like when mothers enter the experience of being a motherhood, they feel like they have some certain expectations. This means that more often than not, when the experience becomes extremely tiring and extremely testing, they often guilt-trip themselves into feeling bad, right? They feel like, why am I not being happy as a mother? Why am I going through so much struggles? This means that they're less likely to seek recourse because they feel like they are a bad mother, but it also means there's less social capital towards helping these mothers, which is something that Adil and Midis talked about, because they are seen as already rewarded by virtue of the fact that they are a mother. This is extremely absurd. Oh yeah, sure.
Ms. Indrini Raja is a widely successful lawyer and minister in the Singapore government. Do you think she qualifies as a success story and an inspiration to women?
Yes. Okay. I think that this is where I'll deal with this later, alright? So I think that this means, right, the rhetoric that society uses will be one that you ought to be a mother or you should be to be a mother, and that nothing else can give you that level of fulfillment. I think they need to deal with the core of this debate, which is the word intrinsically. Right? So people are less likely to understand when mothers are unhappy, and this cognitive dissonance is something that's extremely important, because when mothers feel like they are expected to be happy, but they are not, this is where there's a certain level of cognitive dissonance. I think that besides less recourse and less accommodation, this means that individuals are more likely to stay within abusive relationships because they feel like they're supposed to be able to derive some form of transcendent fulfillment from these experiences. So I think that the world in which we prefer is one where we let individuals subjectively decide what makes them happy, or subjectively decide what ought to be fulfilling, instead of telling them that this experience will give you fulfillment regardless of the situational factors that are existing, right? I think that the premise of that case is that mothers, this helps mothers who choose to be mothers. I think that this is unresponsive to two things. Firstly, that oftentimes they choose to be mothers because of societal pressures. This means that their choice is inherently not meaningful. But secondly, even in cases where mothers genuinely want to start a family, this is this often is ammunition for people outside the feminist sphere to acquire less rights towards these mothers, right? Because they're seen as people who are doing something that's fulfilling towards them. This means it's less likely for your child or your husband to appreciate you at the point in which you're seen as deriving some form of utility or pre-existing utility from this experience. So even in the stakeholder that they wanted to talk about, which is mothers that choose to be a mother, I think necessarily the benefits, that the harms outweigh the benefits in this scenario. I think that at the end of the day, we prefer a world in which the feminist movement maximize the agency of women and allow them to derive subjective happiness from things instead of telling them what their life ought to be. Very proud to propose.
Right, I thank the government whip. Now welcome the opposition whip.
I've been told that I was a very difficult child to raise. So if anything, I hope that we win so that my mother has something to cling on to at the end of the day. Because if she doesn't have motherhood and its intrinsic benefits, then I'm going to go home and give her a very big hug. Because that's the whole point, right? What we are pushing here is a very simple idea. We don't think, and here's the problem with debaters nowadays, they use so many words like cognitive dissonance and narratives, and I'm not quite sure what was said. But it boils down to this one principal idea. Is it true that if we were to do this, there is a dominant narrative that pushes out all other choice for women? Because I am telling you that you need to be a mother because it's intrinsically enriching. We don't buy that. And I'm going to explain that in 2 points. One, whether we push out choices, and secondly, I'm going to talk about state assistance, and what exactly is the impact on the state, what kind of assistance we're going to give. So firstly, is it true that this is a dominant narrative? We don't think so. Women look around and they see success stories all around. Miss Indrani Raja has no children and she's widely successful. Anna Wintour, the name in the fashion industry, don't think she has children, widely successful as well. There have other success stories as well. Women who have widely successful careers and children. Serena Williams, a newly minted mother. Meryl Streep, the most decorated actress in our generation and of all generations. We have a rich library of feminist literature, opinion editorials, and BuzzFeed articles that constantly remind us about the struggles of women in our day and age, that reminds them that they have several choices out there. So we don't buy this idea of a dominant narrative. That's not how human beings work. But let's look at what they are trying to do, because they said it's dangerous, right? They said we cannot push this line of thought, because the moment you do that, everything goes. So clearly the natural conclusion from that is they want it removed. They don't want feminists to even talk about it. That has to be the conclusion, right? Because it's so toxic. Right. But what's the problem with that? If women stop telling other women that being a mother is something that is intrinsically enriching, you don't give support to a group of women who really need our support. I've been told that when you go through a pregnancy, your body changes, your life changes, and if I were to quote Robbie Williams, who was there at the birth of his first daughter, a child, he said it was like watching his favorite pub burn down. So there are many things going on here, and it is a thankless job. So at the very least, what we need to do is to give credit where credit is due. Right? That's where the state comes in and say that being a mother, despite all it being thankless, has its intrinsic worth. Because let's face it, stripped of all sentimentality, it's basically your mother making sure that you don't die under her care and that you go out and be a successful person and you contribute back to society. And if that's the case, the very least we can do is push through a narrative to tell them that what they're doing is worthwhile. This is a narrative and substantive coming from Robin they never dealt with. Then they came back and said, you're going back to the days of the old where you tell you women that their place is at home. No. Rather different, right? Back in the day, we've got to understand how societies worked, right? Agrarian societies, men went out there, did work, then they said, your place is at home. Then cultures developed around that idea. They used this to their advantage. They say, well, since your place is at home, from my mother's place at home, my grandmother's place is at home, it should be your place as well, right? They use this to clamp down. The anti-feminist and the patriarchy uses this to push women down. What we want to do is that we want the feminist movement to own it. We want the feminist women to go out there and tell women that you are free to make your choices and do whatever will make you happy, but if you were to make the choice of being a mother, it is intrinsically enriching. And we give support to a group that desperately requires it. That's where we're coming from. Then we talk about the state, right? What was their argument here? For some reason, They said that if we push through our policy, then they will roll back policies that are favorable for women and mothers. That to us doesn't make sense. Because if you want to push through these policies, you need as much help as possible. You need the critical mass of support. That's how laws are passed. It does not make sense for feminists to let go of this narrative, because this is a narrative that has the most purchase. Everybody loves their mother, or most people love their mother. I can't speak all, like it's a complete generalization, but most people do. So this is a very easy narrative for other people to buy in. That's why we see massive gains, right, in terms of policy changes. That's why we were able to push through things like policies to make sure that single mothers have flats, right, or have houses for them to stay in. Because we want to capture this idea that being a mother has an intrinsic worth, that there is something that we as a state need to cater to and assist as far as possible. Now, if the feminists were to let go of this narrative, to let go of something that most people will be able to easily believe in and will have a lot of purchase, then you don't have the momentum required to earn and achieve all these policies moving forward. And we think that's a massive problem on our end. We think the only way to achieve that is through advocating this principle. Then they move on to this rather ridiculous point. They said, and this came from First, if we don't push through, if we advocate this principle, this belief, then the state is going to deprive women of abortion clinics. They are not going to provide any pro-choice support at all, because you are telling them that it's either you become a mother or nothing at all. Now, there are problems with this logic, right? Because just because I say that there is some intrinsic worth to you being a mother does not mean I stop being pro-choice. They are completely different concepts altogether. All I'm saying here is, if you choose to be a mother, then so be it, but we do not abandon the idea that a woman should have choice over her own body, that is for a decision for her to make, and not for men sitting in the legislature to decide on behalf of women. And if that's something that you want to push through, we think you can still push forward this policy. You can push forward this policy. We do not understand why exactly this would be abandoned. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a debate where people have tried to muddle it up by talking about narratives and cognitive dissonance, whatever that means. Still do not know what that means. But at the end of the day, it's simple. Do we believe that there is going to be a dominant narrative that squeezes everything out? That's just not reasonable. But what we need to do is that if you think it's so toxic and you've got to remove it, we think that's dangerous. We need to give help where help is needed. We're proud to oppose.
Thank you, Opposition Whip. I now welcome the Opposition reply.
They're asking us to defend this idea to defend a narrative that purports to pressure women into being mothers and to make them feel like less of a human being just because they choose not to be a mother. That's not what we said from any of our speakers. That's the patriarchy speaking. That's non-feminists who speak, who, yes, do perpetuate this narrative. But that's never been what we're defending. Never once did we say that being a mother is the only valuable choice that a woman can make. Right from the get-go, we have told you that the stance we're taking in this debate is that feminists should come outright and say that if you choose to have a career, if you choose to be an entrepreneur, that's valuable, that's intrinsically rewarding, you should do that. If you choose to be a mother, that's intrinsically rewarding as well. Sometimes it may not seem that way when your child is misbehaving, but it is rewarding and we should celebrate it as well. So that is what we presented, and they've never once engaged with this particular scenario. In fact, we have told you that it's precisely because of the development of feminist discourse up to this point in time, whereby the focus has largely been on workplace rights for very understandable historical reasons, that there actually is a growing narrative that if you were to give up your career, if you will choose to stay at home, instead choose not to advance up the corporate ladder, you are somehow letting women down. You are somehow a bad feminist who have chosen not to be part of the feminist movement combating the patriarchy. We say that narratives are meant to balance each other, and right from the first, we have told you how this narrative is also a necessary corrective to other strands of narrative in the feminist movement that could be telling mothers that you are a bad feminist and you are outside the realms of good opinion within the feminist discourse. Something they've never engaged with because they've never understood that different narratives clash with each other, interact interact with each other and enrich each other all the time. Which then brings me to something interesting that the third speaker said. That's the only guy who tried to answer why exactly the presence of this narrative will lead to a predominant narrative. We acknowledge that narratives are supposed to have persuasive power, and to the extent that women are persuaded to be mothers because of this, it is because this message has traction, because it appeals to something deep inside the human condition. But the fact is, understanding that the majority of women have become mothers and many more women will choose to become mothers, we posit that feminism must have something valuable to say about that experience as well. Must have something valuable to say to that single mother whose entire life revolves around loving their son. To that mother in a poor household who has spent their entire lifetime raising 5 kids and situates their identities around being mothers. And when a feminist comes in and say, this narrative is something we don't believe at all, it is much more valuable for you to have a career, you opt out of being valuable and relevant to the experiences of these women. Something we have talked about time and time again that they've never engaged with. So to the extent that narratives are valuable, we celebrate a multitude of narratives that includes this particular narrative as well. So if asked them time and time again, if you don't celebrate this narrative, what exactly will you say about motherhood? To which the second speaker gave a particular lukewarm answer. We'll just tell mothers this is a legitimate choice, as if it's no different from choosing whether to eat char kway teow or Hokkien Mee for lunch, right? It's a legit choice. There is no value attached to this choice at all, choosing not to be a mother. We say that when you say that, you become irrelevant to mothers who see motherhood as something important to themselves. Because we think that feminists should go outright and say that motherhood is actually a great opportunity to effect social change as well. Because feminist motherhood can be invaluable in bringing up a next generation of girls who actually want to combat the patriarchy, and bring up a next generation of men who respect and support feminism as well. That is invaluable. There is no reason why social change cannot happen through this as well. But for this invaluable message to have any sort of traction, feminists cannot opt out of this as well. So, understanding all this, the last particular group of women that I talked about, what about mothers who regret their decisions later in life? Mothers who say that, I wish I was never a mother. And we acknowledge their struggle. We sympathize with their struggle. But the fact is, a choice has been made. It is largely an irrevocable choice because killing babies is not legal right now. The point here is, to the extent that this is the case, we need a narrative that can also offer support for them as well. To understand that whilst what you're going through right now may be difficult, you are ultimately involved in an endeavor greater than yourself. Much like a fireman, much like a soldier, you are serving something invaluable and therefore that should be celebrated as well. For all these reasons, we are proud to oppose.
I thank opposition reply, and now the final speaker, government reply.
So I'm not sure my mother ever wanted children. I know for a fact my father wanted 4, and my mom managed to convince him to stop at 2, as per the government directive. I've often asked myself as a result, what is motherhood really? And to some people, I think motherhood is a subjectively good thing. One of the many good things we can achieve in life. I don't mean like eating char kway teow, obviously, right? It's about whether you want to scale down efforts. It's about whether you want to have a fulfilling career. It's about whether you want to like start up an NGO or volunteer at your local mosque or church. Significant decisions, but there are many significant decisions. But motherhood is not merely something that's subjective. Motherhood is in many instances a sacrifice. Because don't let them talk to you and tell you that it's an intrinsically fulfilling experience, that it's its own reward for having children. No, it's a sacrifice. Like, the average mom doesn't want you to tell her that she lives an intrinsically fulfilling experience by being a mother, and that's what society tells you. No, she just wants a recognition for the fact that she wasted 20 years of her life raising you, and hopefully you make something out of it on her behalf, because otherwise it would have all gone to waste. Like, it is about recognition of sacrifice, and unfortunately, your failure to recognize what motherhood actually is means they sell a false narrative to these individuals. Because it's not merely one narrative among many, it is a dominant narrative. Because in most societies, like including our own, like sure, the most enlightened among us will believe that yes, it is indeed one narrative among many, and with examples of success like Dr. Indranee Rajah, all that is great. But for most individuals, the historical holdovers of sexism and of gender expectations with regard to female, like the role of the woman in the household, still stay. And they've got to contend with that reality, the uncomfortable reality that hides in the shadows of our households. To the average person, A narrative does not look as if like, oh no, it's just one narrative among many. I can be like Anna Wintour, or Meryl Streep, or Dr. Indrani, because most of us will be lucky if we were to be within sniffing distance of Dr. Indrani's career prospects. For the average person, it's not about being the best that you can be. It is about escaping the very human and very visceral expectations placed upon you by your average Chinese family, your average Malay family, your average Indian family. And the people who perpetuate those narratives are not only your own government, which tells you it's your duty for you to have children, but your own family, your own friends, people asking you, when are you going to get married? When are you going to have children? You are forced or coerced into embracing the markers of success that don't really define you as a human being and risk social ostracism when you fail to conform. That is what it means to have a dominant narrative. That is something that is not able to contend with throughout this entire debate, and that's why we win. But the second thing I want to talk about is about how we harm mothers and how you harm them, right? Because the average person, like I'm not talking about just mothers, but the average person, that as I said in my second, and as well as we mentioned in our first, they don't simply just react to the fact that motherhood is inherently fulfilling in a positive way. Because not everyone is as kind-hearted as the person who genuinely believes, okay, since motherhood is an inherently fulfilling experience, we ought to allow you to pursue your dreams of being a mother while still being a working woman and change its corporate practices for the better. Most companies and most individuals don't have the same incentives in mind. And they will interpret that perception that motherhood is intrinsically fulfilling as, well, it's great you're a mother. I guess you've reaped your own reward. Why should I help you as a result? And that is the uncomfortable reality that we see in our households, in our corporations at present. And as for the average mother, what does she look like or what does she want? Because sure, there are many mothers who feel that motherhood is intrinsically a good thing. All power to them. But there are other mothers who want explicit recognition for the fact that they are sacrificing a vast majority of their life or the bulk of their life for something that benefits society. And the society ought to explicitly recognize them better, not through empty platitudes, but actual policies that help them lighten their burden. And for the many mothers who were coerced precisely because of these historical trends and because of societal pressure into having children they didn't want or into having a life they didn't want, perhaps we need to find something better to tell them that maybe we can help the rest of the future generations truly understand what it means to be a mother and the potential sacrifices that may entail, that maybe it's not for you, rather than selling them empty freaking platitudes and telling them, oh, it's fulfilling, when for most of them it never will be. We're the only side that even in the worst case scenario where we don't achieve short-run change, we achieve long-run change because we are unafraid to confront uncomfortable realities and to deal with them head-on, square-on, like brave feminists used to do in their previous lifetimes. Cheers.
Thank you to all the speakers for their speeches. The debate's now concluded. The speakers will cross the floor, shake hands. The judges